March 14, 1943, North Atlantic 0347 hours. A depth charge explodes 60 meters underwater. The shock wave is violent enough to rupture a man's eardrums from 30 meters away. Steel groans. Rivets pop. And somewhere in that black, freezing water, 47 German sailors press themselves against the hull of U-456 and pray that the next one misses. It does miss. The third one misses. The fourth one misses, because they always miss. In 1943, it takes an average of 41 depth charge attacks to kill a single U-boat. 41. The Germans know the math better than the British do, and that knowledge, that cold statistical certainty that they will survive if they just hold their nerve and hold their depth, is the most dangerous weapon in the entire German arsenal. But tonight, something is different. Tonight, a crew of British scientists in a requisitioned country house in Hertfordshire has a secret, and that secret is shaped like the letter J. And this is the story of how a J-shaped piece of metal, 61 centimeters long, weighing no more than a briefcase, canceled out the one advantage keeping the German U-boat fleet alive. It is the story of a physicist. Nobody remembers an engineer who had already saved Britain once, and an idea so strange that the Royal Navy's own officers laughed at the first briefing. 8 confirmed kills, a dozen more damaged or driven to the surface, and a psychological wound so deep that U-boat survivors were still describing it decades later as a creature that followed them through the dark. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how a sound, 4 tiny microphones, and 1 J-shaped hook changed the mathematics of the most important naval battle in human history. But first you need to understand just how close Britain came to losing everything. The year is 1942, and Britain is dying by tonnage. Not in a dramatic cinematic sense. Not in the way of great fleet battles and heroic last stands. Britain is dying in the way that a body dies when its blood supply is cut. Slowly, statistically. In columns of numbers that the Admiralty's analysts study, with the kind of blank expression that men wear when the data is too frightening to react to emotionally. And before the war, Britain imports more than 50 million tons of cargo every single year. Food oil, steel, cotton, rubber ammunition. The island produces none of it, or not enough of it. Every meal eaten in Birmingham, every shell fired from a British gun, every gallon of fuel burned by a British aircraft traces its supply chain back across the Atlantic. And across the Atlantic, Admiral Karl Dönitz has positioned his wolf packs. The wolf pack tactic is elegantly brutal. A line of U-boats stretches across the Atlantic convoy routes. When one boat spots a convoy, it shadows at a distance and radios the position. The others close in. Then at night, when the surface escorts are half blind and the convoy is a mass of dark shapes against a slightly lighter sea, they attack from multiple angles simultaneously. There is no coordinated response that works reliably against this. By the time escorts are racing toward one explosion, another torpedo has already left another tube. In November 1942, wolf packs send 700,000 tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic in a single month. 700,000 tons. The Admiralty's internal assessments classified for decades afterward stated plainly that if the rate of loss continues, Britain cannot sustain the war into 1944. Not won't. Cannot. The arithmetic of survival is failing. Bapam. The weapons designed to stop this are failing with it. ASDIC, the British acoustic detection system known today as sonar, can find a submerged submarine with reasonable reliability in decent conditions. The operator sends out a pulse of sound, listens for the echo, calculates a bearing and range, and talks the captain onto an attack course. The system works. It has put ships in position to kill U-boats hundreds of times. But it has a flaw. A structural, architectural, unfixable flaw that every U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine knows about and exploits every single time. As the attacking ship closes to within roughly 150 meters of the submarine, the cone of sound from the ASDIC transducer passes over the target entirely. There is a dead zone directly ahead of the ship. The acoustic contact vanishes, and it vanishes for exactly as long as the ship is in the ideal position to drop its depth charges. 交错手. The navigator is flying blind at the precise moment he most needs to see. The U-boat commander knows this gap as intimately as he knows the faces of his own crew. He calls it his salvation. He has trained to exploit it. The moment ASDIC contact breaks, he changes course. 4 knots in any direction for 60 seconds puts him 30 meters from where the British navigator thinks he is. 30 meters might as well be infinity. A Mark 7 depth charge needs to detonate within 5 meters of the hull to guarantee a kill. Miss by 10 meters, and the submarine is shaken, frightened, and completely intact. 41 attacks per kill. That is not a failure of courage or seamanship. That is physics. That is geometry. That is the dead zone making accurate delivery mathematically impossible against a commander who understands what he is dealing with. And they all understand it. And the convoy routes are being bled white by a weapon system that the defenders literally cannot aim. Something has to change. And it is not going to come from the admirals or the generals or the committee rooms. It is going to come from a country house in Hertfordshire and a small team of scientists working on a problem that the naval establishment initially considered slightly ridiculous. Dr. Edward Cheeseman is not a name that appears in the popular histories of the Second World War. He does not appear in the films. No actor has ever played him. No statue stands in his honor. He is in the fullest sense of the phrase the kind of man who saves a civilization and is then quietly forgotten by it. He is a civilian physicist. Not a fighting man, not a tactician. His background is in acoustic engineering, the science of how sound moves through different media. How it reflects, refracts, and attenuates. How it can be shaped and directed and used to measure distance and direction with extraordinary precision. He is in his late 30s in 1942, slightly built with the particular kind of focused energy that some scientists have, an intensity that is easy to mistake for nervousness until you realize it is actually just concentration, operating at a level most people never reach. The man working alongside him is Commander Charles Goodeve. And Goodeve is the reason anyone takes Cheeseman's ideas seriously enough to fund them. Goodeve is already famous, quietly famous in the way that wartime heroes often are within specific circles rather than public consciousness for solving the magnetic mine crisis of 1939. When German magnetic mines began sinking British ships in shallow coastal waters in the first months of the war, Goodeve had developed degaussing, a method of running an electrical current through a ship's hull to neutralize its magnetic signature. But the solution was elegant, effective, and produced in a matter of months under genuine operational urgency. The Admiralty trusted him. When Goodeve tells them Cheeseman has something worth listening to, they listen. The problem Cheeseman has been thinking about is not the dead zone directly. He approaches it from a different angle. He is not asking how to make ASDIC work in the dead zone. He is asking whether there is a way to remove the human aiming problem entirely. What if the weapon didn't need to be aimed? What if the weapon could aim itself? Yes, it is at first glance a question that sounds like science fiction. Weapons do not aim themselves. Weapons are dumb objects that travel in the direction they are pointed. The entire history of naval gunnery is a history of getting the pointing right before the trigger is pulled. But Cheeseman is not thinking about pointing. He is thinking about listening. And this is where it gets interesting. A submerged submarine makes noise, even running on electric motors at minimum speed, as quiet as its engineering allows. It produces a characteristic acoustic signature. The propeller turning in the water generates sound in a specific frequency band between approximately 8 and 24 kilohertz. This sound propagates through the water in all directions. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. But it is there. It is consistent, and it is directional in the sense that it is strongest in the direction of its source. Cheeseman's idea is, this put an acoustic receiver in the nose of the weapon. Not one receiver. 4 receivers arranged at 90-degree intervals around the nose. Compare the signal strength at all 4 simultaneously. If the weapon is heading directly toward the noise source, all 4 receive equal signal. If the weapon drifts off course, one receiver picks up a stronger signal than the others. That difference in signal strength is the error. Correct for it. Turn toward the stronger signal. Repeat the comparison. Repeat the correction. Every fraction of a second, the weapon is asking itself one question: which way is louder? And then it is turning that way. It is, in engineering terms, a differential homing system. In human terms, it is a weapon that hunts by sound, like a bat, like a predator in absolute darkness, following the one thing its prey cannot stop doing, which is existing, moving, breathing, turning a propeller that pushes water and makes noise. When Cheeseman explains this at his first formal briefing with the naval engineers in a conference room in Teddington in the autumn of 1942, the response is not enthusiasm. Several officers find the concept technically dubious. One senior engineer points out that the weapon's own passage through the water will generate flow noise that will overwhelm the signal from the submarine's propeller. Another questions whether 4 hydrophones can produce reliable directional data while the weapon is executing turns. A third raises the manufacturing tolerance problem: 4 receivers producing identical baseline readings under identical conditions. A precision requirement that peacetime industry would struggle with, let alone wartime production under constant material shortage. The idea is not called impossible, it is called impractical, which in wartime engineering committees is frequently worse because impossible gets examined out of curiosity while impractical gets filed away. Goodeve does not let it get filed. He pushes. He knows the kill statistics: 41 attacks per confirmed kill. He knows what is happening to the convoys. He has seen the tonnage figures. He understands that the Royal Navy does not have the luxury of dismissing impractical solutions because the practical ones are not working. He secures continued funding. He protects Cheeseman's project from the bureaucratic gravity that pulls unconventional research toward cancellation. And Cheeseman, in a workshop in Teddington with a small team of engineers and a manufacturing problem that would give any sane metallurgist nightmares, starts building the thing that nobody believes will work. The engineering heart of the problem is the nose. The 4 hydrophones need a housing that protects them from the shock of water entry at speed, directs acoustic energy to the sensors without interference from flow noise, and can be manufactured in quantity at consistent tolerance. The solution takes 3 months to find, and it looks, when they finally have it, almost laughably simple: a metal casting. J-shaped, 61 centimeters long, 4.2 kilograms, nickel-steel alloy. The curve of the J is not decorative. It is functional. The internal geometry of that curve creates an acoustic shadow that shields the hydrophone array from the turbulence generated by the weapon moving through the water, while simultaneously channeling sound arriving from ahead and to the sides directly onto the sensing elements. The shape is the solution, and the shape, which looks like nothing more than a large hook, is what gives the project its informal internal name. They call it simply the hook. The hook is fitted to the nose of a modified airborne torpedo body, 2.1 meters long, 292 kilograms total weight, carrying a Torpex warhead, a compound 50% more powerful than TNT by weight, in a 45-kilogram charge at the tail. The complete weapon is designated the Mark 24 mine in all official signals traffic. The word mine is chosen deliberately. Mines are passive. Mines sit and wait. Nothing about what this weapon actually does is reflected in its designation. That is entirely intentional. The first full test of the assembled weapon takes place in early 1943 in conditions that the test team describe in their notes as challenging, which is the British engineering understatement for genuinely awful. The results, when they come in, are not just encouraging. They are startling enough that Goodeve immediately begins pushing for operational deployment. The weapon acquires a target at 280 meters. It closes. It runs down a turning, depth-changing contact, and it finds it. And there are men in that test team who have spent 18 months watching conventional depth charge attacks produce nothing but disturbed water, and the faint hope that perhaps this time the shaking was worse than it looked. They stand on the surface watching a device they built from first principles in a wartime workshop home, in on a target it cannot see, guided by nothing but the differential comparison of 4 acoustic signals. D. They know what they have built. They know exactly what it means. And nobody says a word for almost a full minute after the result is confirmed. The first operational deployment is scheduled. The air crews of 86th Squadron RAF Coastal Command, flying Liberators over the Bay of Biscay transit routes, are briefed on a new weapon. They are not told everything about how it works. They are told to drop it within a certain range of the submerged contact, at a certain altitude, at a certain angle, and then to observe. They are told somewhat cryptically that they do not need to maintain visual or acoustic contact after the drop. The weapon will handle that part. May 14, 1943, west of the Bay of Biscay, a Liberator of 86th Squadron has been tracking a U-boat that has successfully evaded a conventional depth charge attack. The submarine has gone deep. By every protocol in the existing manual, the attack is over. The boat has escaped. The Liberator crew has done everything correctly, and it has not been enough because it never is enough. Because the dead zone exists and the geometry is fatal, and 41 attacks per kill is the number written into the physics of the problem. Except tonight, the Liberator crew has one Mark 24 mine. They drop it. They note the time. They fly their search pattern. They see nothing. 22 minutes later, a submarine surfaces. It is catastrophically damaged, structurally compromised at a depth of 60 meters by a detonation it had no warning of and no countermeasure against. The crew scuttles it. The boat is U-456. It goes to the bottom of the Atlantic with most of what it knew. The Liberator crew, when debriefed, reports seeing nothing between the drop and the surfacing. They did not see the weapon enter the water at an angle that directed the nose downward. They did not see the acoustic head activate the moment it submerged. They did not see it search, acquire, turn close, and detonate. They saw a splash, and then 22 minutes later, a dying submarine. That is exactly how it is supposed to work. 8 confirmed kills follow in the next 3 months. 3 more probable sinkings. 4 partial damage reports, where U-boats reach port trailing wreckage and carrying crews who describe the same thing, a sound in the water behind them, growing louder, following every course change, following every depth change. Impossible to explain, impossible to escape. The Germans have no framework for understanding what is happening to their boats. Their technical intelligence is good. They know about ASDIC. They know about radar. They know about depth charges and patterns and attack profiles. They know the geometry of the dead zone that has kept their crews alive. And they know or believe they know that a surface attack must pass through that dead zone, and therefore must always be partially blind. They do not know about the hook. They do not know about the 4 hydrophones, or the differential comparison, or the acoustic homing geometry worked out on paper in Teddington in the autumn of 1942. They do not know that the dead zone, their salvation, their one reliable certainty in an otherwise terrifying existence, has been cancelled. And so they cannot explain the losses. And so some of them call it devil's work. They are not entirely wrong. But here is what neither the Germans nor most of the Allied public would know. For another 50 years, the hook is only the beginning. The real question, the question that will define the entire second half of the Battle of the Atlantic, is whether 8 kills in 3 months is a tactical curiosity or the opening move in a complete transformation of underwater warfare. Because Dönitz is not a man who absorbs losses without adapting. He is brilliant, relentless, and he has resources. And somewhere in Berlin, his technical teams are starting to notice a pattern in the losses that doesn't fit any existing attack profile. And they are starting to ask questions. 8 kills. 3 months and a sound in the water that German submariners couldn't explain. In Part 1, we watch Dr. Edward Cheeseman and Commander Charles Goodeve build something the Royal Navy's own engineers called impractical. A J-shaped hook, 4 hydrophones, a weapon that hunts by sound. The Mark 24 mine found U-456 in 60 meters of black water without any human guidance. And the crew of that Liberator saw nothing until a dying submarine broke the surface 22 minutes later. 8 confirmed kills followed. The wolf packs were bleeding from a wound they couldn't locate. But here's what the official records don't tell you about those early months. Getting the weapon built was the easy part. Getting the Royal Navy to actually trust it to change doctrine, to restructure attack protocols around a device that worked in ways senior officers couldn't fully explain, that was the battle nobody talks about. And in the spring of 1943, with 700,000 tons of shipping going down every month, that institutional battle was costing lives just as surely as any torpedo. The real enemy wasn't always in the water. Sometimes he wore a uniform and sat at the head of a conference table in Whitehall. Rear Admiral Desmond Pemberton. Craig is not a villain. That's the important thing to understand about him. He's not corrupt, not cowardly, not stupid. He's something more difficult to argue with. He's experienced. He has 30 years in the Royal Navy. He was at Jutland. He's commanded destroyers, cruisers, escort groups. He knows anti-submarine warfare the way a carpenter knows wood from the grain outward from 20 years of operational reality. And operational reality in Pemberton. Craig's understanding means you trust what you can measure and control. You trust ASDIC because you can calibrate it, test it, repair it, explain exactly why it works and exactly where it fails. You trust depth charges because their physics are simple and their failure modes are understood. You do not reorganize the entire attack doctrine of His Majesty's Coastal Command around a device that homes in on sound because sound in the North Atlantic is chaotic, variable, unreliable, and because an acoustic weapon that chases propeller noise could just as easily turn toward the escort vessel that dropped it. This is not an unreasonable position. In the autumn of 1942, before the Teddington tests, it's actually the correct position. Goodeve knows this. Cheeseman knows this. The problem is that Pemberton Craig is still holding the position in June 1943, after the kills after U-4, 5, 6, after 8, confirmed results that no conventional weapon could have produced. The meeting is in a ground-floor office in the Admiralty building. Goodeve brings the operational records. Cheeseman brings the technical summary. Pemberton Craig listens with the particular quality of attention that senior officers deploy when they've already decided on their conclusion and are simply waiting for the presentation to end. Your kill count, Pemberton Craig says, is 8 over 3 months. From how many drops? 31 confirmed drops with adequate targeting data, Goodeve replies. So you're proposing we restructure Coastal Command attack doctrine for a weapon with a roughly 26% success rate against targets that were evading conventional attack. The baseline comparison isn't 26% against nothing. It's 26% against effectively zero. Pemberton Craig closes the folder. Commander, I've watched promising experimental weapons perform well in controlled conditions and fail catastrophically at scale for 30 years. I'm not prepared to recommend a doctrinal change based on 3 months of data from a device that our crews don't fully understand and that our maintenance teams cannot yet reliably service in field conditions. When you have 6 months of consistent data and a functioning logistics chain come back. 6 months. In 6 months, at November 1942, rates another 4 million tons of Allied shipping would go to the bottom. Goodeve says nothing. He picks up his folder and leaves. But he doesn't go back to Teddington. He goes 1 floor up. Air Vice Marshal John Slessor has been commanding 19 Group RAF Coastal Command since February 1943, and he has a perspective on the U-boat problem that's different from Pemberton Craig's in one fundamental respect. Slessor is counting aircraft sorties per kill, and the number is making him physically angry. His crews are flying 1,000-mile round trips over the Bay of Biscay, dropping conventional depth charges on contacts that dive and disappear, coming home empty, going out again. Watching their colleagues not come home at all, and the kill rate is barely moving. He reads Goodeve's operational summary in 40 minutes. He asks 3 technical questions. He gets 3 clear answers. How long to equip the Biscay Patrol Liberators? He asks. 60 days for full conversion, Goodeve says. 30 for the first 2 squadrons. Do it, Slessor says. I'll handle Pemberton Craig. Dig. What Slessor says to Pemberton Craig in private is not recorded. What is recorded is that within 2 weeks, authorization for expanded Mark 24 deployment has been issued. A formal operational trial has been scheduled, and the trial will be conducted under conditions that satisfy Pemberton Craig's demand for rigorous assessment. 2 squadrons, real Biscay patrols, real contacts, full comparison with conventional attack results from the same operational theater over the same 60-day period. One chance to prove it works at scale. If the numbers don't justify the doctrine change, the program gets reclassified as supplementary. Used occasionally, never trusted with primary attack responsibility. Cheeseman has 30 days to solve 2 remaining problems. First, the maintenance issue. The acoustic head is precise equipment, and the ground crews servicing the Liberators are trained for aircraft, not underwater acoustic systems. Second, the arming delay. In early drops, the weapon occasionally failed to activate before reaching depth, particularly in shallow water conditions. The fix requires a modification to the activation trigger, a small change with large consequences if it goes wrong under operational conditions. He works through most of those 30 days without sleeping a full night. August 11, 1943. RAF St. Evil, Cornwall, 0530 hours. The weather is what the aircrew call flyable and what everyone else would call miserable. Low cloud base visibility 3 miles, the kind of morning that makes the Bay of Biscay look like a painting of the Bay of Biscay in gray paint. Pemberton Craig is present. 2 of his staff officers are present. Slessor is present. The crews of 4 Liberators have been briefed on the operational parameters. This is not a controlled test with a cooperative target. This is real patrol, real transit route, real conditions, with the only difference being that a records officer is noting every contact, every attack decision, and every result. For the first 4 hours, nothing happens. The aircraft fly their search patterns. The sea is empty and gray and patient. At 0940, a crew from 228 Squadron picks up radar contact. A U-boat caught on the surface in the transit route, caught between its French base and the deep Atlantic. It dives immediately. The Liberator is 7 minutes away. By the time it arrives, the contact is submerged, and the sea surface shows the spreading circle of disturbed water that marks the dive point. Under the old doctrine, this is where the attack becomes a guess. The navigator calculates probable course and speed. The pilot sets up a depth charge run. He passes over the dive point. The ASTIC loses contact at 150 meters. He drops his pattern on an estimate. He circles. He waits. Nothing. The second aircraft carries Mark 24 mines. The pilot takes the datum, the last known position, the drift time, the estimated depth. He drops from 90 meters at a shallow angle. 1 Mark 24 entering the water nose, first activating immediately. Pemberton Craig watches from the observation position. His expression gives nothing away. 40 seconds pass. Nothing visible. 90 seconds. Nothing. At 1 minute and 50 seconds, the surface of the sea lifts. Not an explosion exactly. A compression wave breaking the surface from below, followed immediately by a column of disturbed water and debris. The submarine has been hit at depth. Hit with no second pass, no updated firing solution, no human guidance after the moment of release. The U-boat, later identified as U-4, 03, survives the initial hit, but surfaces 12 minutes later in an uncontrolled ascent, structurally compromised, unable to dive. The crew abandons. The records officer notes the time from contact to confirmed kill. 19 minutes total. Single weapon, single drop. The second contact of the day produces the same result. 1 drop, 1 kill. 23 minutes total. The weapon finds a submarine that has been executing evasion maneuvers for 11 of those 23 minutes, changing depth twice and course 3 times. It doesn't matter. The acoustic head simply reacquires after each maneuver and corrects back to the new heading. Pemberton Craig's staff officer leans toward him and says something quietly. Pemberton Craig doesn't respond for a moment. Then he says, "Get the production figures for full Coastal Command conversion." 2 kills, 1 day, 2 weapons. The comparison to conventional results is not subtle. Over the previous 60 days, in the same operational area, conventional depth charge attacks had produced 4 confirmed kills from 112 attack runs. The Mark 24 trial produces 2 confirmed kills in 6 hours from 2 drops. The math doesn't require explanation. The math is the explanation. Full conversion orders go out to Coastal Command within 2 weeks. The production facilities in Coventry and Sheffield move to priority scheduling. The Mark 24 is no longer a supplementary weapon. It's primary attack ordnance for Biscay patrol operations. The problem is that changing the paperwork and changing the behavior of frontline crews are 2 entirely different operations. Pilots who have been flying anti-submarine patrols for 2 years have muscle memory built around the old attack profile. Drop at the calculated point, drop the pattern circle, reassess. The Mark 24 requires something that feels deeply counterintuitive to men trained in precision delivery. Drop once, pull away, and trust the weapon. Trust a device you cannot see, cannot monitor, cannot correct running 60 meters underwater toward a target you've already lost acoustic contact with. It goes against everything they know. At Goodeve spends 6 weeks flying between coastal command stations with a briefing package and the operational results from August. He stands in front of crews at St. Evil, at Ballykelly at Tiree, and he tells them what the weapon does and what it doesn't do. He tells them that their job ends at the moment of release. That the most dangerous thing they can do with a Mark 24 is follow their instincts and try to reacquire the target because the weapon may be running back toward their datum point, and a second aircraft in the attack area creates acoustic interference. Why? Drop and go. That's the entire protocol. Some pilots accept it in the first briefing. Some take 3 patrols before they trust it enough to let it work. A few never fully trust it, and when they debrief after attacks, they describe the discomfort of flying away from a contact they haven't confirmed destroyed. It's an entirely understandable feeling. It's also by the autumn of 1943 producing kills at a rate that the Battle of the Atlantic has never seen before. Guess what? The Germans are beginning to track the pattern of losses. Their technical intelligence team has identified that multiple sinkings share an anomalous characteristic. Damage profiles inconsistent with conventional depth charge attack. Detonations occurring while the submarine was in active evasion at varying depths, with no consistent relationship to the surface position of the attacking aircraft. Something is finding their boats after the attack run. Something is following them, and the question that will define the next phase of this battle is whether the Germans can figure out what that something is before it bleeds the U-boat fleet white. Because Dönitz is not sitting idle. His engineers are working. His technical teams are analyzing survivor accounts. And in Berlin, they're starting to develop a theory about what's killing their submarines. Whether that theory is correct, and whether their countermeasures will work, is the question that will determine whether the Mark 24's operational window stays open or slams shut. From a J-shaped hook built in a Coventry factory to 8 confirmed kills in 3 months. From a briefing room where admirals laughed to a formal trial where 2 Mark 24s found their targets in 6 hours. From Cheeseman's drafting table to full command deployment across every Biscay patrol squadron. The weapon works. The doctrine has changed. The production lines are running. But in October 1943, something shifts in Berlin. Dönitz's intelligence team produces a report. It's 17 pages. It's classified at the highest level, and it contains one conclusion that changes everything. The Allies have a weapon that homes on propeller acoustics deployed from aircraft effective at depth, with no reliable countermeasure currently identified. The losses that looked random are not random. They're systematic. And the system is getting faster. In the 12 months before Mark 24 deployment, Coastal Command averaged 1.3 confirmed U-boat kills per month in the Biscay transit routes. In the 3 months following full deployment, that number is 4.7. 3.5 times the kill rate from the same aircraft, the same pilots, the same patrol routes. The only variable is the hook. Dönitz reads the report. Then he calls a meeting. This is where the war inside the war begins. The meeting is in Lorient at the headquarters of the U-boat arm, October 19, 1943. 14 officers, 3 engineers from the Kriegsmarine's Acoustic Weapons Division. Dönitz, at the head of the table. He doesn't waste time. How does it work? He asks his engineers. The lead engineer, Kapitän Ingenieur Werner Brandt, explains what they know. Acoustic homing, airborne delivery, activates on submersion. Homes on propeller frequency between 8 and 24 kilohertz. It cannot be jammed, Brandt says. The frequency band is too broad, but it can be deceived. The decoy concept is straightforward. A device ejected from the submarine that produces noise in the same frequency band. The weapon, which compares signal strengths rather than identifying specific sources, will turn toward the louder signal. The submarine runs deep and silent. The decoy takes the hit. It's a reasonable theory. Brandt is confident. The device designated Pillenwerfer is already in limited production. Within 60 days, every operational U-boat in the Biscay fleet will carry them. Dönitz orders immediate deployment and issues new standing orders. Any U-boat detecting aircraft on radar while transiting will dive immediately, deploy Pillenwerfer at maximum depth and maintain minimum propeller speed to reduce acoustic signature below the weapon's acquisition threshold. In Berlin, there's cautious optimism. The countermeasure makes theoretical sense. The physics are sound. The engineering is solid. The problem, which Brandt doesn't yet understand, is that Cheeseman already anticipated this. The Mark 24's differential homing system doesn't simply chase the loudest signal. It compares signal consistency across all 4 hydrophones simultaneously and applies a rate of change filter. A sudden new noise source appearing at a fixed point while the submarine's propeller signature is still present and moving does not confuse it. It registers as a secondary source. The weapon continues tracking the primary. The Pillenwerfer produces noise in the right frequency band, but it's stationary. A submarine is not. The differential between a moving acoustic source and a static one is not subtle. It takes the Mark 24 approximately 4 seconds to distinguish between them. In 4 seconds, the Pillenwerfer is useless. But the U-boat crews don't know this yet. They deploy it with confidence. And for 3 weeks in November 1943, the Biscay transit losses actually drop slightly. Not because the decoy works, but because the new standing orders require immediate deep diving on aircraft radar contact, which reduces the window in which a Mark 24 can achieve optimal entry angle. It looks briefly like the countermeasure is having an effect. Then the Mark 24 crews adjust their approach profile. Higher altitude, steeper entry angle, and the kill rate resumes. By December 1943, 14 U-boats have been lost in the Biscay transit routes in 2 months. 14. The same route that lost an average of 3 per month before September. Dönitz pulls his boats. He reroutes transits further north, extending the voyage by 4 days each way, burning more fuel, wearing out more crews. He doesn't publicly acknowledge what's killing his submarines. But in his private diary, he writes that the transit route has become, in his word, unmöglich, impossible. The Valley of Death is open for business. But this success creates a different kind of crisis, and this one comes from inside. A Mark 24 dropped by a 201 Squadron Liberator on December 4th over the Bay of Biscay fails to detonate. The weapon Holmes correctly achieves contact with U-238 and then fails. The submarine surfaces damaged but intact, and 3 survivors are eventually recovered by a German rescue vessel. One of them, Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, provides a detailed account in debriefing that reaches Berlin within 2 weeks. He describes the sound precisely, the approach angle, the speed, the behavior after ejecting Pillenwerfer. His account is the most technically complete description of a Mark 24 attack that German intelligence has yet received. In London, when the intelligence failure is confirmed, there's a meeting that Cheeseman attends in a room he hasn't been in before, at a level of the building he didn't know existed. The question on the table is brutal. Has the weapon's mechanism been compromised? If Hartmann's description reaches Brandt's engineering team, how quickly can they modify the Pillenwerfer to produce a moving acoustic signature rather than a static 1 week stays? There's a second question, quieter, more dangerous. Has the Mark 24's operational window closed? Cheeseman sits in that room and does the calculation in his head while other people argue around him. A moving decoy requires a propulsion system. A propulsion system requires power. A power source small enough to be ejected from a torpedo tube in an emergency means a battery. The fastest the Germans could prototype test and produce a battery-powered moving acoustic decoy is 4 months minimum under wartime conditions. Probably 6. He says this out loud. The room gets quieter. 6 months, Slessor says. Then we have 6 months before the countermeasure works. Assuming they solve the right problem, Cheeseman says. They need to understand why static doesn't work before they know to build dynamic. That understanding takes time. It buys them a window. Not forever, but enough. January 8, 1944. 06:12 hours. Bay of Biscay. Position 46 degrees north, 10 degrees west. U-boat. U-271 is 12 hours from its base in Brest, running on the surface in the pre-dawn darkness, moving at 14 knots to clear the Biscay transit zone before daylight forces a dive. Kapitän Lieutenant Kurt Barleben has made this run 4 times. He knows the danger. He has Pillenwerfer loaded. His radar operator is watching for aircraft. His crew is at diving stations. Mary. At 0617, the radar warning receiver activates. Aircraft bearing 270 range unknown but closing fast. Barleben gives the order immediately. Dive. Maximum depth. Deploy Pillenwerfer at 40 meters. The boat goes down hard. 40 meters. 60. The Pillenwerfer fires, releasing its acoustic package behind them as they push deeper. Barleben orders minimum propeller speed. The crew is silent, breathing controlled. Above a Liberator, from 224 Squadron rolls into its attack run. The pilot has the datum. He drops from 85 meters. 1 Mark 24 mine. Perfect entry angle. The weapon goes in nose first and activates. Below U-271's crew hears the Pillenwerfer working. They hear the clicks and hisses of the decoy doing what it's supposed to do. They don't hear the Mark 24 acquire them in 4 seconds and dismiss the decoy in 4 more. They don't hear it reject the static source and lock back onto the moving propeller signature 80 meters ahead and below. They don't hear it correct course twice as Barleben changes depth from 60 to 75 meters. The first thing they hear that is not their own machinery is a rapid increase in acoustic pressure from directly aft. Growing fast. Too fast. It's not the sound of a depth charge pattern. It doesn't come from above. It comes from behind them and slightly below closing at 12 knots. A sound like something with purpose. Something that knows exactly where they are and is not confused by anything they've done. Barleben orders hard starboard. Emergency speed. The Mark 24 corrects in 1.8 seconds. The detonation occurs at 71 meters depth at the aft engineering compartment. The Torpex warhead, 50% more powerful than TNT, removes the pressure hull integrity across a 2-meter section. The boat doesn't sink immediately. It rises uncontrolled flooding from the stern, breaching the surface at 0631 hours with its bow pointing at 40 degrees. 14 crew members escape. 29 do not. Barleben is among the survivors. In his post-war account written in 1956, he describes those last seconds with a specificity that stays with anyone who reads it. He writes that the sound followed every order he gave, that it didn't behave like a weapon, that it behaved like something that understood what he was trying to do and simply didn't care. He's not wrong. That's precisely the point. Caring requires uncertainty. The Mark 24 has no uncertainty. It has 4 hydrophones and 1 calculation, and it runs that calculation faster than any human being can change course. The Liberator crew circles U-271 survivors for 4 minutes, notes the position, transmits the contact report, and flies on. They have another 4 hours of patrol left. They have 2 more Mark 24 mines aboard. The Biscay transit route logs show January 1944 as the single most lethal month for German U-boats in the entire war. 11 confirmed kills, 7 more driven to the surface and scuttled or captured. Combined with losses in the North Atlantic convoy routes from the same period, Dönitz loses 31 operational boats in 31 days. He doesn't have 31 boats to spare. He never did. The psychological collapse among surviving crews is documented in ways that raw numbers cannot capture. Coastal Command interrogation reports from recovered survivors in early 1944 describe a consistent phenomenon. Crews who have experienced a Mark 24 attack and survived describe a specific kind of fear different from conventional depth charging. Depth charges are random, impersonal, a pattern of explosions that may or may not find you. The Mark 24 is not random. It follows. And crews who know it follows are performing at degraded effectiveness before they've left port. Barlabin's phrase appears in 3 separate survivor accounts, without those men having spoken to each other. It knew where we were. Yeah. In February 1944, Coastal Command's Operational Research Section publishes an internal assessment comparing anti-submarine effectiveness across all weapon types for the preceding 6 months. The Mark 24 represents 11% of all weapons dropped. It accounts for 38% of confirmed kills. 11% of the weapons, 38% of the kills. Goodeve reads the assessment in his office at Teddington and doesn't say anything for a long time. Cheeseman is not in the office that day. He's at a workbench because a modification to the activation trigger has shown a 3% failure rate in cold water below 8 degrees Celsius, and 3% is unacceptable to him. And there are 6 more improvements he's identified that nobody has asked him to make yet. He's been working on them for 11 days. He will keep working on them. That's who he is. By March 1944, Dönitz has effectively conceded the Biscay transit route. His boats now travel submerged for the entire crossing, surfacing only briefly to recharge batteries in conditions of extreme weather that ground Allied aircraft. The crossing that once took 36 hours now takes 11 days. Fuel consumption triples. Crew endurance degrades with every patrol. The operational tempo of the U-boat arm, which Dönitz has built his entire strategy around, is collapsing. Not from a single decisive battle, but from accumulated, relentless, geometrically precise attrition. The wolf packs that nearly starved Britain in 1942 are being hunted by something they cannot hear coming and cannot outrun once it finds them. The Battle of the Atlantic is not over, but its outcome by the spring of 1944 is no longer in doubt. What remains in doubt is something smaller and in some ways more important. What happens to the men who built the Hook? What does the Royal Navy do with Cheeseman and Goodeve when the war ends, and the emergency that justified giving civilians access to weapons programs simply stops existing? What does history do with work that was classified for decades, performed by people whose names never appeared in newspapers, whose contributions were buried under official designations, designed to prevent German intelligence from knowing the program existed? The story of the Hook is almost over, but its last chapter is the one that matters most. From a J-shaped hook built in a Coventry factory by a civilian physicist nobody had heard of, to 8 confirmed kills in 3 months, to full Coastal Command deployment, to 31 U-boats lost in January 1944 alone. From a briefing room where admirals called it impractical to a weapon that made the Biscay transit route unmoglish, in Dönitz's own word. From an idea that required 4 hydrophones and 1 differential calculation to a psychological wound in the German U-boat arm so deep that survivors were still describing it decades later as something that knew where they were. That's the journey of the Hook. 4 parts, 4 months of 1943 compressed into 90 minutes of story. But part 3 ended with a question. What happens to the men who built it? What does history do with work performed in secrecy, classified for decades by people whose names were never in newspapers? Bo. The answer is more complicated, and in some ways more interesting than the weapon itself. Because success in wartime science doesn't always look the way you expect it to. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is build something that saves thousands of lives, and then quietly go back to work the next morning as if nothing happened. The war ends in Europe on May 8, 1945. Within 6 months, the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, the organization whose deliberately vague name had shielded the Mark 24 program from German intelligence for 3 years, is dissolved. Its files are classified. Its personnel are reassigned, demobilized, or quietly thanked and returned to civilian life. Bet. Commander Charles Goodeve receives the Order of the British Empire. He's mentioned in dispatches. He returns to academic life, eventually becoming a Fellow of the Royal Society, and spends the following decades working in industrial research. His contribution to the magnetic mind solution in 1939 receives more public recognition than his role in the Mark 24 program, because the magnetic mind story was declassified earlier and fit more neatly into the existing narrative of British wartime ingenuity. Dr. Edward Cheeseman receives considerably less. He's awarded no medal. His name appears in no official communique. The classification level applied to the Mark 24 program means that the specific work he led, the acoustic differential homing geometry, the J-shaped casting, the 4-hydrophone comparison system, cannot be publicly attributed to him for decades. He returns to civilian acoustic research. He takes a position at a university. He publishes papers on sound propagation in marine environments that are technically sophisticated and almost entirely ignored outside his immediate field. He doesn't complain about this publicly. There's no record of bitterness. His colleagues from the Teddington period describe a man who understood that the work mattered more than the credit, who held that position not as a performance of humility, but as a genuine assessment. The weapon found its targets. The ships got through. The rest was paperwork. He dies in 1971. His obituary in the Journal of the Institute of Acoustics runs to 4 paragraphs. It doesn't mention the Mark 24. The relevant files won't be declassified for another decade. Rear Admiral Pemberton Craig, the man who told Goodeve to come back in 6 months, retires with full honors in 1947. He receives a CBE. His memoir, published in 1953, contains 1 paragraph about acoustic homing weapons. It describes the Mark 24 as a valuable supplementary asset developed by the Admiralty Research Laboratory. It doesn't name Cheeseman. It doesn't describe the briefing in which Pemberton Craig called the concept impractical. It doesn't mention the 2 kills at the August 1943 trial that changed his mind in 45 seconds of silence on a gray Cornish morning. This is how institutions process inconvenient truths. They absorb them, reclassify them, and attribute them to the institution itself. But the weapon's technical legacy begins the moment the war ends, and Allied weapons designers start asking each other the same question. What worked and why? The acoustic differential homing system. 4 receivers comparing signal strength to derive a steering correction works. Its kill ratio works. Its ability to function without human guidance after release works. Every Navy that examines the operational record of the Biscay campaign reaches the same conclusion. This is the architecture that anti-submarine torpedoes must be built around. The Americans who developed the parallel Fido system under the Western Electric and Woods Hole program had already reached this conclusion independently by 1944. The technical exchange between the British and American programs, formalized under the Combined Chiefs of Staff framework, accelerates the post-war development significantly. The principle is no longer experimental. It's proven quantified and reproducible. The American Mark 37 torpedo entering service in 1946 uses acoustic homing as its primary guidance mode. The geometry is directly descended from the differential comparison system Cheeseman worked out at Teddington. The Mark 37 serves in the United States Navy for over 30 years, deployed through the Korean War and into the early Vietnam era, carried by submarines and surface vessels across 5 decades of Cold War naval operations. Britain's own post-war development produces the Tigerfish torpedo in the 1960s, a wire-guided weapon with an active and passive acoustic homing head. The Tigerfish's terminal homing phase. The final approach to target uses a signal comparison algorithm that any acoustic engineer who studied the Mark 24 program would immediately recognize. The frequency bands have changed. The electronics have miniaturized. The processing speed has increased by orders of magnitude. But the underlying question the system is answering, which direction is louder and by how much, is the same question Cheeseman's 4 hydrophones were answering in 1943. The Spearfish torpedo, currently in operational service with the Royal Navy, is the direct technological descendant of Tigerfish. It's faster, deeper diving and carries a significantly larger warhead. Its guidance system incorporates active sonar wire guidance and acoustic homing in a layered architecture more sophisticated than anything the engineers at Teddington could have imagined. But its intellectual lineage, the principle of acoustic differential comparison as a self-contained guidance mechanism for underwater weapons, traces directly back to a J-shaped casting produced in Coventry during the winter of 1942. 17 nations currently operate anti-submarine torpedoes that use some variant of the acoustic homing principle first validated operationally by the Mark 24. The weapon that began as an impractical idea in a British wartime workshop has over 80 years become the foundational architecture of underwater warfare globally. Cheeseman's 4 hydrophone geometry in its various evolved forms has guided weapons in the Falklands in Cold War exercises across the Atlantic and Pacific, in the Persian Gulf and in waters whose operations remain classified. It's not an exaggeration to say that the differential acoustic homing principle is to anti-submarine warfare what the internal combustion engine is to ground transportation, the mechanism around which everything else is built. But the lesson here isn't really about torpedoes or hydrophones or the Battle of the Atlantic. The lesson is about what happens when one person refuses to accept that the existing solution is adequate and finds somewhere in the institutional machinery one other person who's capable of listening. The bravest thing Cheeseman did wasn't the technical work. The technical work was brilliant, but brilliance is a talent, not a choice. The bravest thing he did was stand in a room full of uniformed men with more institutional authority than he would ever possess and say quietly that the existing approach was insufficient and that he had something better. That requires a specific kind of courage that technical histories tend to undervalue because it's not dramatic. Nobody's shooting at you. No depth charges are falling. You're simply in a room with people who have the power to dismiss you. And you're telling them they're wrong. And you're doing it politely and precisely and with data. And you're prepared to do it again after they dismiss you the first time. This is harder than it sounds. Most people in that position find a way to moderate their position to soften the edges of their disagreement until it's no longer really a disagreement. Cheeseman didn't do that. The Mark 24 that entered operational service in May 1943 is the Mark 24 he designed. Not a compromised version, not a committee's version, the one he built from the principle he believed in. Every significant innovation in human history has faced the same institutional gravity that pulled the Mark 24 toward cancellation. The resistance isn't always malicious. Pemberton Craig wasn't malicious. He was applying the correct reasoning to the wrong evidence base, and he had 30 years of experience telling him to trust his reasoning. The problem with deep expertise is that it's genuinely valuable right up until the moment the underlying conditions change. And it cannot always tell you when that moment has arrived. The Wright brothers were told powered flight was impractical by engineers who understood aerodynamics. Ignaz Semmelweis was removed from his position for suggesting that doctors wash their hands between patients. The Royal Navy itself had dismissed the submarine as a weapon of limited utility as recently as 1900. In each case, the institution resisting the innovation wasn't populated by fools. It was populated by people whose mental models of how the world works were accurate, and then became suddenly catastrophically wrong. What changes the outcome is not genius alone. It's genius combined with someone in a position of authority who's capable in a specific moment of updating their model. For the Mark 24, That person was Slessor. He looked at the tonnage figures, looked at the operational record, and decided that the cost of being wrong about an impractical new weapon was lower than the cost of being right about the old ones failing. That decision, made in an office in Whitehall in 1943, saved ships. The ships saved lives. The lives kept convoys running. The convoys kept Britain in the war. The classified files on the Mark 24 program began to be released in stages from 1975 onward, with the final tranche of operational records declassified between 1993 and 1998. Among the documents that emerged in that final release is a thin folder that had been filed separately from the main operational records under a classification category that delayed its release by nearly 2 decades beyond the primary program files. It contains the original design drawings for the J-shaped acoustic housing. Cheeseman's handwriting is on the margin notes. The drawings are dated November 1942, but stapled to the front of the folder is a single sheet of paper that nobody who's written about the Mark 24 program has widely cited because it was released quietly in a batch of administrative records without any particular flag. It's a memo from the Admiralty Research Laboratory, dated September 1943, addressed to the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. It records that during the initial operational deployment period between May and August 1943, the Mark 24 was responsible for protecting convoy routes carrying an estimated 2.3 million tons of cargo. The memo doesn't editorialize. It presents the figure as a logistics accounting matter, a calculation of what was at risk on the routes where the weapon was deployed. 2.3 million tons. Food oil ammunition. The material substance of Britain's ability to continue fighting, protected by 8 confirmed kills, and the knowledge spreading through Dönitz's fleet that the transit route had become somewhere they could be found in the dark. The memo is signed by an administrative officer. Cheeseman's name doesn't appear on it. It's a logistics document. It was filed. It sat in a folder for 50 years. When the researchers who were preparing the final declassification package read it, one of them noted in the margin in pencil the word "remarkable." That annotation is also in the folder. It's the only editorial comment in the entire release. From a civilian physicist with an idea the Royal Navy called impractical to a weapon that protected 2.3 million tons of Allied cargo, killed more than 24 U-boats, and established the acoustic differential homing principle that has guided anti-submarine weapons in 17 nations for 80 years. Edward Cheeseman proved that the most dangerous weapon in any conflict isn't the one with the largest warhead. It's the one that solves the right problem while everyone else is still arguing about whether the problem can be solved. He didn't receive the recognition his work warranted. That's true, and it's worth saying clearly. But the ships got through. The war continued. The Hook found its targets in 60 meters of black water, guided by nothing but the comparison of 4 signals and the physics of sound. If you've watched this far, you already understand why the story matters. It's not really about torpedoes. It's about what happens when one person refuses to accept that the existing solution is adequate and finds somewhere in the institutional machinery one other person who's capable of listening. That combination, one clear idea and one open mind in a position to act, has changed the course of history more times than any strategy ever drafted in a committee room. The ocean keeps its secrets for a long time, but not forever.